Taylor English down in Atlanta, and has represented both the franchisee and the franchisor side. So we're really happy to have him as our guest today, and he's going to be doing a considerable amount of the talking here once we get into this. So, Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, guys, class 2401, happy to have you guys here. Welcome to everybody. This is our fourth group session. We have one remaining that will be held in about 2 weeks. So total of 5 group sessions, and we'll get into it here. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about the big picture, where we've been in this journey path towards making a decision on getting into franchising or not, and if we do, which franchise do we want to get into. So we'll talk about where we've been, where we are currently, and where we're going. We'll show the leaderboard of all the students that are in the in the class 2401 here, and where everybody stands in terms of what step they're in. The big focus today is about the FDD. We've talked about the due diligence is made, frankly, very easy. Accumulating all the information about buying a business through franchising is made very easy through this franchise disclosure document. Most of the pertinent information you're going to need is going to be housed within that. We'll talk about the options that you want to take for reviewing that FDD. You've got 4 options. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what to look for in that FDD, right? So there's a lot in there. You need to read all of it, but there are certain things that you need to pay probably extra attention to. Then we're going to talk about validation. That's step 8 for us, right? That's, frankly, I think that's many people's favorite part. There's both group and individual. We're going to take questions at the end. And then we're going to do the last 10 minutes. We're going to do a breakout session with your coaches like we did before, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss more, specific or intimate or personal things that pertains to your situation. So that's our agenda for today. Next slide, Edgar. So this is where we've been. We are currently at this group call, which is we're covering steps 7 and 8. This does not replace the individual coach calls that you're going to have on step 7 and 8. So I just want to point that out as well. This is extra stuff, right? There's a lot in these 2 steps. They're very important steps. All the steps are important, frankly. But this is to give us some extra exposure and knowledge to inform your decision as you move down this path. We're currently in week 7. Week 10 is really what this process is designed to, that's the full duration. And at that point, people are going to move. Some will move a little bit faster, as you'll see. Some will move a little bit slower. But really the goal is to condense this, put in the work that's necessary, put in the research that's necessary with a support system that, frankly, you won't have at any other time in your journey path to franchising that you've got right now. You'll never be equipped or have the timing right to decide and act upon this as you are right now. So 10 weeks is really what we strive for. So we're about 70% of the way through that. We are, just to put it in perspective as well, really those first 4 steps, really internal, right? That's where we're thinking about, what kind of skills do we have? What kind of lifestyle do we want this franchise business to afford for us? What role do I want to play in the franchise? And really that matching part and figuring out what I'm best suited for. Steps 5 through 8, and we're at the tail end of that, is really where we do that due diligence. We're talking to outside parties. We're talking to franchisors. We're talking to franchise attorneys, maybe. Validation, we're talking with other franchise owners. And then really steps 9 and 10 are the final steps. Due diligence is largely done. If it feels like a good match to the franchisor, they will invite you to what's called a meet the team or a discovery day. Vice versa, the flip is true as well. If you feel like you're a good match for them, you will accept that invitation. You'll go to that discovery day. If that all goes well, and both parties fully agree that this makes good sense, you'll end up signing a franchise agreement, pay your franchise fee, and you off to the races. So that's where we are. Next slide. This is where our 14 folks in class 2401 currently sit. We've got one there. Derek is at step 8, starting validation. We've got 2 that are in FDD review. it looks like about 7 that are in step 6 in funding, and 5 and 4 that are still in step 5 franchisor call. So if you're a little bit behind, no big deal. Do your best if you can to catch up if you're able. If you're a little bit ahead, that's fine too. It's really meant, like I said, to be 10 weeks, give or take a few, so that we get you through this in a timely fashion. Okay, next slide. All right, so what is an FDD? An FDD is a franchise disclosure document. It is a phenomenal document because what it does is it consolidates all the information that you're going to need to make a decision on that franchise, all housed in one thing. If you've ever bought a business in the past that is an existing business, you'll realize that the hardest part about the due diligence is simply accumulating all of the information that you're going to need in order to make that decision, all the stuff that you've got to review. When you're buying a new business, like a new franchise territory, a lot of that information is going to be housed within this document. It's not all of your due diligence. There are other aspects of it, validation being one that we're going to get to. But it is a phenomenal document. It really describes the relationship that you're going to have with your franchisor. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Michael here and let him, you know what, let's go on to the next slide, Edgar. I'm going to turn it over to Michael in 1 second. Okay, so when you guys get to this step, first of all, you will be asked you're going to have to get the FDD from the franchisor themselves. You can get it through other sources, but you have to have that for at least 14 days, and that is a federal requirement, so that you have a cooling off period to make sure that you don't make any brash decisions, and you've got at least 14 days from the receipt of that FDD until you're able to sign a franchise agreement. So you will have to sign for it when the franchisor sends it across. It does not obligate you to anything at all. It's just a compliance thing for them to make sure that you've received it. But you've got 4 options when you get that, okay? 2 of those are mandatory. The first 2 here are mandatory. First one everyone hates to do, okay? But I'm telling you right now, you need to do it. It's really important. It's going to describe that relationship. It's going to be 50, 60, 70 pages of stuff. And then there's going to be an addendum with a whole bunch of stuff. But it is a very important document. You need to read it. I suggest printing it off or putting it into a Word document that you can, do pen and ink changes on, or a workable PDF, some way that you can kind of write down any questions and concerns that you have. The second step is also mandatory. You need to review that with the franchisor. They're probably going to have some information up front that they're going to review with you, but you're also going to have an opportunity at that point to address all the questions and concerns that you have. So anything you don't understand or don't know what it means, or anything that seems overly, at the benefit of the franchisor and at the expense of you, the franchisee, this is the time to ask all those questions. Something doesn't feel right or you don't understand it, this is the time to ask it. Don't not let those questions be asked. The final 2 are not mandatory, but if you have further questions and you want to review that with your coach, you can certainly do that. And then the last option, which we recommend that you take, is to review the FDD and the franchise agreement with a franchise attorney. And so that one, the first 3 are free. That one is not free. If you want to use Michael or one of the other franchise attorneys that we've got partnerships with, they have agreed to a discounted rate and a package rate and a set rate for reviewing those 2 documents with you. What I do recommend is if you have an attorney, do it regardless of who you use. Make sure it's someone who understands franchising law. Don't have the guy that put your will together, or the woman that did your divorce or whatever, right? You want to have somebody who is experienced in franchise law, because there's going to be certain clauses and things that are really pertinent to somebody, that a lawyer that's not trained in that is probably not going to pick up on. Okay, next slide. All right, off to Michael. Michael Rosenthal, thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Chris. Well, first of all, as we jump into this, I want to reemphasize what Chris said, which is read it. Like, clients call me all the time that want me to review the FDD for them. I'm happy to do it. The first question I ask them is, have you read it yourself? And what questions do you have for me? And I frequently hear, haven't read it. It's really long. It looks boring. Don't want to read it. And my response is, make yourself a pot of coffee, sit down on Saturday morning and read it. Just whatever stimulants you need to stay awake, take them and read the document. It's really, really important because it governs the relationship, particularly the franchise agreement between you and the franchisor. And it's a long-term relationship. So you want to know what's in there so you know what you're getting into and what your obligations are. So kind of diving in, the FDD is divided up into 23 items of information and then attachments, as Chris said, which are all of the contractual agreements and some other attachments like the financial statements from the franchisor. A few that are key, in my view, we're going to run through. Item 2 deals with the background of the leadership at the franchisor. So this lays out their experience over the last 5 years. You want to look at it, understand, is the experience they have relevant to the industry that they're in? And then a lot of times you'll see key individuals who have some franchise background or experience. It's a good opportunity to look at those brands and see, are they known brands that you're familiar with, or are they startups? So you can kind of get a better sense of, were they working for a large organization, a small one, those kinds of things. Item 3 deals with litigation history. So realistically, any large brand, I mean, if you're looking at a big company like Dunkin' or Subway, they're going to have some litigation. That just happens. The question is it a lot of litigation relative to the size of the system, and what rises to the level of concern? If there's a case, typically I don't get all excited about it. But you're just looking at this and saying, are there a lot of disputes that they've been involved in? That's not a good sign typically. And sometimes you can look at it and then go to the relevant courthouse, if it's a court case as opposed to arbitration, and download some of the documents so you get both sides of the story. Item 6, fees and payments. So the franchisor is required to list any fees or payments that you as a franchisee may have to make to them or their affiliates being companies that they have common ownership with. And really, you're just looking to see if the fees are transparent, if they're reasonable, do you understand them? You may want to compare them to other franchisors' fees to get a sense of that. And what you're looking for is any excessive fees or penalties, particularly on termination. That's a big one. So if you decide to leave the franchise system because it's not working out for you or for any reason, are you going to owe them money? And if so, how much? And it's not at all unusual to see liquidated damages laid out in item 6 if you terminate early. Liquidated damages means there's a method for saying or determining how much you're going to owe to them if you terminate early. Sometimes it's a fixed amount, and sometimes it's just a formula like 2 years of royalties would be very typical. Again, it's not a good or bad thing. It's just knowing what you're getting into and understanding that's a business risk that you're willing to take. Edgar, can I get you to flip over to the next slide, please?
Michael, if we could, we'll pause for questions. Michael got several slides here, but does anybody have questions on any of the items 2, 3, or 6, or anything Michael has spoken about so far? We'll take questions at the end, but I know a lot of times, something he said might acutely kind of trigger something. Does anybody have any questions on any of these?
This is John. I got a question. So when we receive the FDD and we're reviewing it, looking at all these key things, do you have like a template that goes through each one to say, hey, these are the questions or these are the key items you should be looking at, similar to what your slide is showing? So like, for instance, item 6, if there's we get out of the get out of the franchise and there's liquidated damages, like you mentioned, do you have like a template that goes through all the 22 items and says, hey, these are the things that you should be looking at or at least have concern with?
I'm sorry, I don't. I think you should read all of it and make sure you understand all of it, and then just make notations, anything you have a question on, uh, whomever you're working with as an attorney. Sarah?
Michael, I was just going to add that for all of you on the call, in your portal, under step 7, there will be an outline of what each item will entail, so take a look at that, and then also take a look at some of the questions under step 5, because it will ask about exit strategy, etc. So I'd say on the portal, step 5 and 7 will have some information.
Okay, thank you. And then secondly, when we receive the FDD, do we sign as saying we received it, or is it a sign saying we agree with it?
You're just simply saying that you received it. So there's a receipt page. Actually, there's 2 receipt pages at the back. One receipt page is for your records and the others for the franchisor. And now most franchisors will have you sign that electronically. But all you're saying is, I got it, and I got it on this date.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Edgar. So item 7, I think this is a really, really important thing for you to understand. This lays out the initial costs that a franchisee would expect to incur. It's usually a range from the time they sign the franchise agreement until 90 days after they've opened their franchise for business. So just as an example, if it were a restaurant, you sign the franchise agreement, you have to go find some space to lease, you've got build out, you've got to hire employees, and then at some point you open. And then you carry forward 90 days from that. That's all supposed to be encapsulated in item 7. And a couple of points. One, we noted here, verify the accuracy of the information that is in there with current franchisees if you can. I really recommend that you create a pro forma, which essentially lays out your investment cost, all your startup cost, the operational costs, not just for 90 days, but maybe for the first year or even 2 years, to try to give you some idea of what your expenses will be. And if you are able to use Excel, I think it's a great tool to plug in different revenue levels and see how that impacts your costs for certain things, like, again, using the restaurant example, food costs, labor and employment costs, those kinds of things. But I think understanding item 7 is critical to understanding what you're getting into financially and understanding, hopefully, a little more about how much revenue your business is going to need for you to get to the point where it's profitable. Item 11 is a really long item with a bunch of information in there. It really deals with both operations of the business and training. It talks about marketing, usually talks about whether there's a marketing or advertising fund. It talks about things like software and technology you're going to use in the business. It talks about what support, if any, the franchisor is going to provide for you. And it has a separate section that's supposed to lay out the training schedule, essentially, that you're going to be going through. So there's a table in there that shows you what they're going to do, what they're going to train you on, and how much time they're going to spend on each aspect of training. I look for it to be as detailed as possible, so you get a better sense of really what am I going to be learning. And they also have to give you a copy of the table of contents of their operations manual. So you're looking at that not to see what's in the operations manual, it's just a table of contents, but the sense is, is there a fair amount of information that's likely to be in here? And is it the stuff that you would expect to see or to be learning as you are starting a business? Does it cover what you're going to need to start your business? If you're doing due diligence, I would also ask existing franchisees if the training met their expectations. I think that's really critical, because one reason you're buying a franchise is because typically you do not know how to run this type of business, but they're supposed to. So you're looking for them to train you, and you want to ask franchisees what they got out of the training. Was it what they thought it would be? Item 12 deals with territory. Key points are, is your territory exclusive in nature? What exactly is reserved to you and what is reserved to the franchisor? And then, can the territory change if you get a renewal franchise term? So just as an example, if the typical initial term is 10 years, you may have 2 or 3 5-year renewal rights. And as a part of that, the franchisor may or may not, under the terms of their contract, have the right to change your territory. And that's important to know, because if you spend a lot of time building up a business, you certainly want to know whether the franchisor can put somebody else nearby when you're coming up for renewal. And typically we would see that in fast growing geographic areas where the franchisor is reserving the right to add more units because there's just bigger population. So places like Texas and Florida and Arizona, which are growing really fast. I'm going to pause for questions before we go on to the next slide.
I have a question, Michael. Have you seen where with like some of the franchisors have population limits on territories, like 100,000 people? Have you seen where they?
Derek, you may have clipped. I'm not sure if it's you or me, but
Sorry.
yeah, I heard. Have you seen where they? And then it kind of glitched out from my end.
Sorry, it could be me. I'm at work. Great Wi-Fi here. Where franchisees have been able to negotiate larger territories in metro areas. Like I live in Southern California, and some of the franchisors I'm talking to, they're 100,000 population per territory, and for me, that's like one city. Right, and that's I would say almost non-sustainable.
So I'm going to answer that maybe a few different ways. First of all, it depends on what kind of business you're getting into. That could really impact things. Yes, sometimes it's negotiable, but the negotiation of territory size, to me, follows the same path that we would see for other things that are negotiable. So if it's a newer system, they're more likely to be negotiable with you. If you are geographically desirable to them because you're the first guy in California, they're more likely to negotiate with you. If they already have 43 franchises in the Los Angeles area, don't take offense, but you're nothing special. Right? So you kind of have to look at what the whole scenario is. And again, it really depends on the type of business. If it's some kind of home service business, 100,000 people may or may not be sufficient. I always point out to people that while it's important to look at what you're getting in terms of exclusive area from the franchisor, just recognize that there's other competition besides your fellow franchisees, or there probably is in most industries. So, I live in a town of about 110,000 people, a suburb of Atlanta, and I couldn't tell you how many pizza places we have, right? So it doesn't mean that the next pizza place that opens isn't going to succeed. It just means there's already competition.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Edgar, you want to flip that over? Thank you. Okay. Item 19, financial performance representations, sometimes called FPRs, in plain English, earnings claims, right? What are they telling you about, in some way, shape, or fashion, about how much money you might expect to make? The first thing to know is they're not required. Franchisors are not required to give you any financial performance representations. They can just choose to say, we're not giving you any information. That used to be pretty common. I think the strong trend is for franchisors to provide this information And if they're not providing you with information, you need to ask why. Is there a reason why they're not telling me this? It may be that it's a brand new system and they just don't have much data, but it's a bit of a red flag, and I would definitely want to drill down more with existing franchisees about what they're saying economically if you're not getting this data. And the data can be put in any format that the franchisor wants, with a few minor exceptions. So what we see most commonly is revenue data. So, broken down by quartiles, meaning the top 25% in revenue, the next 25%, and so on. That's fine, at least to give you some sense of what you hope you'll do top line. Ideally, it's great if they also give you some expense data. So franchisors, again, have a lot of latitude. They can give you very detailed expense data down to the last penny, or many franchisors will give you expense data for just key items. So using the restaurant industry example, the key items would probably be rent, employee and staff salaries, and benefits, and food cost. But there are a lot of other expenses that you'd still have if you're operating a restaurant. So you've got insurance, you've got garbage pickup, internet, and so on down the line. If you are seeing a partial listing of expenses, just be aware that there will be other expenses and make sure you cover them. Now we're taking a look back at item 7 to see what some of those things would be. Item 20, franchise unit data. So there are 5 tables in item 20. They talk about things like how many units the franchisor has and has had in place for the last 3 years. They talk about total number of units in the system, and they talk about franchised units. The big thing is just to look at the patterns. Is the system growing? Is it shrinking? And our unit failures are concerned. So I was looking at an FDD for a client this morning. The system had about 85 units in it. And in the last 2 years, they've lost, I believe, 14 of the 85. It is a restaurant. So restaurants, I would expect to see a little lower failure rate than maybe home service or more sales-oriented franchises. And that's a bit of a red flag to me. If it gets above 10 or 15% in restaurant, I would be questioning it. In other types of businesses, that might not be a high failure rate. So you're just going to want to kind of take a look at that and ask, what's going on? Are people successful? And then the converse is true. If you see a system with 100 units and they haven't lost any, or they've only lost 1 or 2 in the last 3 years, that's a real strong positive. It means that people are still in business, they're still operating. And in the real world, if you have 100 businesses, 1 or 2 of them are going to go out of business for reasons which have nothing to do with the quality of the franchisor. I've just seen all kinds of things, from a family illness, somebody just doesn't like operating the business, and then any number of human decisions that we all make that cause us to want to leave a business and walk away from it. And then lastly, items 21 and 22, these deal with audited financial statements and contracts. The financial statements are a little hard to read for most people. I do recommend that you maybe talk with an accountant about them. I review them when I'm looking at an FDD, but what I'm looking at is the overall financial health of the franchisor and whether there are any red flags in there. But to be honest, unless you have some financial background and training, looking at them probably is a bit challenging for most lay people. And then lastly, the contracts. So you should read the contracts. Now we're back to getting that pot of coffee before you sit down. They're not real exciting, but ask questions. If you don't understand something, don't gloss over it, because it can come back to bite you on the butt later. And I can't tell you how many times I've had franchisees come back to me years later that want to get out or having difficulty, and then something pops up that the franchisor does, which the franchisor has a right to do under the contracts, and my client says, wow, they can do that? Well, yeah, they could do it. It's in the contract. And so you need to know what's in the contract so you know what to expect. And I always also say to clients, kind of quoting an old friend of mine who was a business guy, and he always said, you want to do business with someone whose hand you could shake and feel comfortable that they would honor their word, but you still want to have a contract too. And I think that applies here. And part of that is, they in that contract may apply, even though you think, you bought a Wendy's because you thought Dave Thomas, if you remember Dave Thomas, used to do the Wendy's ads, was a great guy. Well, I got news for you. Dave is dead, and you won't be dealing with him anymore. And actually, Dave had sold Wendy's years before he did all those ads. He was just like the spokesmodel for Wendy's. So you can't rely just on good faith, unfortunately. You have to look at what's in the contracts. So I'll pause here. If anybody has any questions? Sarah.
Just to be clear, Michael, could you just elaborate that who are the audited financials for?
Good question. So the audited financials normally are for the franchisor company. Most systems have multiple companies that they operate. So again, back to my restaurant model, I've got a gal that owns 5 restaurants. She decides to franchise it. She has a business already, Sarah Brown LLC, and she runs her 5 restaurants in that. And then when she comes to me to franchise, we set up a new company called Sarah Brown Franchising LLC, and that's the franchisor, and that's normally who the audited financial statements are for. The exception is if the franchisor wants to rely on the financial firepower, let's call it, of the parent company, that's Sarah Brown LLC, they can attach audited financial statements for that other company, along with a signed guarantee by that other company of the franchisor's obligations. So if a parent company says, hey, this is a new franchisor, but we own it and we want to guarantee its obligations, they could do that. And they just attach the parent company's financial statements.
Thank you.
Yeah, question. This is John again. On that contract that's part of the 22, is that the contract, the final contract that we would sign with the franchisor, or is that just what is that contract?
It's a template, so it's a form of contract. It is the form of contract. So by law, they are required to attach the form of contract that you will be asked to sign. And then if you go to sign the contract, what they will do is they will fill in the form, basically. So they're going to fill in your name, and it's going to have your name, John, and it's going to have your address, typically the territory, and a few other things that are particular to you. But it's going to be the same form of contract. It has to be by law.
Okay, and am I able to negotiate that contract when I'm talking with the franchisor and make changes or adjustments to the contract?
Most typically not, but occasionally yes. So again, we're back to kind of the question that Derek asked earlier. What's negotiable? It's going to depend on the size of the system. Smaller systems are more likely to negotiate. It may depend on their history and whether they're generally willing to negotiate. And it may depend on things like whether they find you geographically desirable because you're the first one in a part of the country they want to get into, or a town they want to get into. So most large systems will not negotiate. You just have to be aware of that.
So that was a great segue, Michael, into this next section for you.
Okay. In terms of the franchise agreement, I guess as a starting point, people often ask me, can I negotiate the FDD? No, you cannot. The FDD is a disclosure document that contains information that the franchisor is required by the Federal Trade Commission to give to you in a certain format. The franchise agreement is a contract, and in theory, it is negotiable. So the question is, what can you negotiate, and what things should you be looking to negotiate? I typically try to get clients to focus. So even though I might give somebody 15 comments about things they might want to negotiate, I always say to them, come back to the franchisor with maybe 2 or 3 items, maybe 4 or 5 items, no more than that, certainly, that you want to try to negotiate. If you come at them with a laundry list of things you want to negotiate, their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to think that you are not a suitable candidate. So really focus. Some of the things we frequently talk about are spousal guarantees. A lot of franchise agreements say that your spouse has to guarantee any payments under the franchise contract. And I typically will push back hard on that. And I recommend that you tell them, if this is true, that your spouse is an independent person. They have their own job, they have their own business, they have their own finances, and that you can't make them negotiate, or sign this guarantee. And I always jokingly say, what would you like me to do? Put a gun to my wife's head to make her sign it? That's not going to work. It also won't make her want to let me into the bedroom at night. But how disputes are resolved is something else that typically we want to look at, and just make sure you understand that process and possibly negotiate to make sure that it's a fair process. It gets pretty granular, so I won't get too much deeper than that right now. And then liquidated damages, I mentioned that earlier. This is simply what happens. Is there a method for determining if you owe them an amount of money if you terminate the contract early? And the key there is A, understanding it, and B, trying to make sure there's a cap on it at a number that you would be willing to pay if you had to terminate early. You wouldn't want to have to pay, for example, a fixed amount of royalties for 10 years if you terminate after 1 year. So that's what we're trying to do, is just cap that.
Okay. Yeah. One thing I would just add to that, Michael, I think everybody, most folks here have probably bought a home in the past. And if you think about, I think a relevant analogy of the relationship between the FDD and the franchise agreement is that if you've bought a home before, you've got the seller's disclosure. Think of that as the FDD of sorts, yep. Right? And then you're going to negotiate certain terms. You may negotiate price. You're going to do an inspection. You may negotiate certain things have to be fixed. Certain things we're going to let go. That's sort of your franchise agreement, right? Is when you come up with that actual purchase agreement for a home. So there's a lot of similarities between real estate and franchising in terms of the process itself. And I think that's another one.
I think that's a good analogy.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. And Michael's going to hang with us, by the way. So he's going to be at the end for questions at the end, as well as kind of dipping into the breakout sessions with each of the individual coaches and their team. So we'll get back to Michael here in just a minute. We're going to cover validation. 2 types, guys. There's group validation. There's individual validation. They're both extremely valuable. With group validation, typically most franchisors will offer that. They're usually at predetermined times during the week, and they'll have a franchisee in that system who's talking about, what that looks like. It's really important, regardless of the type of validation that you go through. This is my favorite part. This is when you get to talk with other franchise owners who are active in the system currently. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What concerns do you have? Were there any surprises? We're going to get to some of the questions to ask them, but these are things that are really important to ask, and you're going to get a different perspective on that answer. Hopefully you don't get vastly different answers than what you've learned about that franchise system so far, right? And that validation is really there's really kind of 5 parts, if you think about it, to the whole due diligence process. You know, the FDD is one of those. That's a government mandated document. You're going to get information from the ZOR, from the franchisor, which you've gotten. You're going to get information from the Z, from other franchisees. That's what validation is. And then you're going to get information from your coaches. That's another perspective. And then other advisors, people like Michael Rosenthal, people like Michael Reeder as a CPA, loan specialists, et cetera. You're going to be collecting a lot of information. But the point is, there's really 5 different perspectives on that due diligence, because everybody's going to offer something a little bit different and something very valuable. The other part about validation that's helpful is there's really only 2 sources where you can go and get financial information. You can get historical financial information in terms of how well that, how well financially the franchise owners do. That's in the item 19 of the FDD. And you're also going to get that from during validation from other franchise owners. They are allowed to talk about and open their books and show you exactly how much they're making, how long it took to get to that point. They're not required to do that, but they are certainly permitted to do that. So it's a really valuable part of the whole process. So ask lots of questions. By the way, franchisees are listed in the FDD. So, you're free to go and talk with them. There are some things to maybe keep in mind. Understand that you might be a franchisee at some point in the future too. So respect their time. You wouldn't want a bunch of potential people calling you at every hour you're trying to run your business. So be respectful that sometimes, some of them may not want to be bothered. And that may be the reason. Also be careful talking to adjacent franchisors. A lot of people say, well, hey, there's one right down the street over or across town that I'd like to go check out. You're free to do that, but understand that if there's an adjacent territory in that same system, and then you're talking to them, if they have an interest in buying that territory and expanding their business, you may have just kind of told them that, it may be off the market, right? So just be careful about little things like that as well. All right, next slide, Edgar. These are some of the questions to ask. Kind of covered these already, but financial performance is big. What are some of the challenges in the system? Every business has challenges, right? Every business has challenges. What are those? And most importantly, how does that franchisor help you overcome those challenges? What kind of communication do franchisees have with one another? What kinds of, how responsive is that franchisor to addressing franchisee issues? No one's perfect. There's going to be issues. I think what's most important here is culturally, how responsive and what kind of feedback systems do they have to be able to address those issues that come up. If you have there's a full list of questions that you can get if you log into your portal, the Vetrepreneur portal, click on step 8, and in the notes area, you'll be able to find a lot of additional questions. And I would use those as a guide when you're going through these validation calls to ask those types of questions. Okay, I think that is it. So, questions overall, anything that hasn't been asked, please, by all means. Okay. That's great. The timing is perfect. We will go ahead and shift to our breakout sessions. Again, the next session is going to be in 2 weeks. You guys should probably have that on your calendars already. And so we will go ahead into the breakout sessions. Edgar's going to go ahead and assign those now.